Welcome to Breaking Down Bergman. I'm David Friend.
And I'm Sonia Strimban.
And we are looking at Fanny and Alexander.
Ja, nu gråter jag, ser du. Glada, fina livet är slut. Det hemska, skitiga livet kastar sig över oss. Jo, det är så. Det är så. Nej. Det här är verkligen inte för sig, min herre. Nu ska jag tvätta mig, sminka om mig. Göra mig lite snygga hår, sätta på mig korsetten och sidenklänningen. En gråtande, ömhetstörstande kvinna förvandlar sig till en samlad farmor. Ja, vi spelar våra roller. Somliga spelar oss slarvigt, andra spelar dem med omsorg. Jag hör till den senare kategorin.
This is certainly Ingmar Bergman's most autobiographical film, and it exudes Bergman in ways that all of his other film productions didn't. There's sort of hints of his past here, there's stylistic touches that are almost definitely Bergman, and a fantastic film overall. In fact, one of his most recognized films when it came to awards.
It's definitely highly celebrated both by the Academy, where I think it won like 4 Oscars.
Nominated for 2 more.
And also I think by audiences. I mean, just personally, it seems every time that we come across people talking about Bergman, Fanny and Alexander is always at the top of the list as a favorite.
It actually, as a side note, it was the only Bergman film that I had seen before we began this project. Revisiting it about a decade after, I was surprised by just how expert this film felt and how different it felt from Bergman's other works, but how familiar everything was as well. And I think that's what makes it such a standout.
For me, the film also felt fairly familiar and comfortable. Like you could enter into the story fairly quickly and with ease. But at the same time, I found a lot of surprises that I wasn't expecting from a Bergman film. And I think the first was the sheer opulence of the production and also the number of characters. Like the cast for this film was huge in comparison to other films. And I think the effect of the large cast was interesting because on the one hand, there were so many different plot lines that you could follow it in a very linear fashion throughout the film and kind of do just an enjoyable, superficial reading of it. Or you could go more in-depth with different vignettes, if you will. So within each couple in the film, different generations, multiple experiences and perspectives. You could go both horizontally, seeing how they develop, but as well as go into great depth of analysis to look more at the characterization, the power dynamics between each couple, and then how they interweave with the other characters and dynamics within the film. So it could be interesting from both perspectives.
Yeah, I think all of those layers are what make Fanny and Alexander so rewarding to so many different people, because viewers who weren't fans of Bergman, or at least weren't familiar with his works before this, were able to enter into the Bergman canon, I think, with Fanny and Alexander in ways that they weren't able to with, say, The Seventh Seal. I've always heard people at least saying they watched The Seventh Seal and it sort of irked them, or they didn't know what to do with it. They found it kind of dull and didn't have any reference points. Fanny and Alexander allows them to sort of ease in with a more linear plot line, more familiar cinematic elements, and really enjoy it, which I think is kind of amusing in a way because this is the last theatrical film that Bergman ever made. He sort of signed off at this point and originally told everyone, this is my last film, period. But of course, if you know Bergman, he was just exaggerating and went on to do plenty of other television productions.
Lots of encores.
For viewers who aren't as familiar with Bergman, it's interesting to note that this was filmed in part in Uppsala, which is where Ingmar Bergman was born and spent much of his youth in his grandmother's home. So there was a real personal element to a lot of the exterior settings of Fanny and Alexander.
For those who know Bergman and are familiar with his work and his tendency to be autobiographical, we would understand that personal touch. But I think for audiences that are newer to Bergman, or we're seeing this from an entertainment purpose, for example, the familiarity of the setting would have been more accessible in general. And I think along with the setting and other kind of more stylistic choices like the rich sets, like the large cast, the heavy costumes, the intricate plot lines, I think they're a good counterbalance to some of the Bergmanisms that we're more used to. So for example, the Grim Reaper at the beginning of the film, the mystical and the magical, which counterbalances the reality and creates multiple layers.
The religious undercurrent.
Okay.
I think at this point we should clarify, though, which version of Fanny and Alexander we're talking about. Now, we watched both, but in this video we're going to be discussing the miniseries, which is the extended cut that was released after the theatrical version. There's a separate video discussing the differences between the theatrical version and the miniseries, and how we think that changed the tone of the production. So when we talk about the first episode of Fanny and Alexander, it is certainly here that Bergman establishes the opulence that you spoke about and sort of creates a base for everything that we're going to see in the next few hours of the storyline. Here is when Christmas time is in the air. There's a lavish dinner, there's gluttony left and right, but it definitely offers us the reference point that we're going to be returning to through the rest of the storyline.
But despite the fact that it's one of the most joyous times of the year, of course this is a Bergman film, so in addition to that, we have the beautiful Christmas decorations, we have the music, the little cherub-like children, we also have the Grim Reaper. We also have ghosts and ghost stories, and like you mentioned, gluttony, and there's continuous undercurrents of misdeeds, of other sins, of tensions, of family crises, of rumors. So it never quite goes away from the true Bergman style of showing a veneer of happiness and lightheartedness, whereas in reality, the true depth is pretty dark.
There's a real skill in the way that Bergman presents this Christmas party, because it also establishes this massive cast of characters, or at least the main players. And he does it in a very subtle way, at least I found. A lot of them are around the table, and the introductions are sort of interwoven with dancing and celebrations and humor. And I think that was one of the most skillful things about this production, and perhaps one of the ones that we didn't necessarily recognize, but that Bergman was able to establish these many, many characters in such a subtle way that the viewer almost doesn't recognize that they've just been introduced to almost, I think there's probably 15 characters around that table.
For me, one of the most interesting was the ways in which he introduced the children. Because the children in this film clearly play a very critical role. I mean, the film is named after them in a way. They are main narrators through observation. So you know that it's important, and for me at least, I was right away paying attention to how they're going to be positioned and integrated into the plot. And he introduced them in a very curious way. In one hand, they're very, very childlike. They're playful. They're clearly there to obey the adults and follow their lead, but they're allowed to be mischievous because it's Christmas and stay up past their bedtime. But on the other hand, they have this kind of profound wisdom about them that's beyond their years. And he subtly inserts this into different scenes. And it really gives the implication that there's a lot more to these characters, to this story, that they're not really children, that really it is Bergman and behind them, especially in the case of Alexander, obviously. But Fanny is a very paradoxical character to me because she's in the title of the film. And yet, throughout the film, her role as kind of a sidekick or a counterpart to Alexander was never really clear to me. There's one scene in particular that I know we talked about and debated the purpose of it there, and that was the scene with the chair and the fairy tale that her father told and her interpretation of it. And I still am not 100% sure how it fits, but it definitely adds a certain weight or significance to the characters of the kids.
I found it interesting that Fanny was the only character who really believed what was clearly a lie that was being presented to the children, and she was rewarded by her father for using her imagination, essentially, or at least that's how I saw it. And I think Bergman was slipping something in here, sort of addressing the value of imagination. And I mean, when it comes to Alexander, his imagination is often shown to us in terms of cinema. He's obsessed with the projector and watching films on it at one point. And obviously Bergman and Alexander, there are a lot of parallels, but I think that these two characters serve as the narrator in a certain way. They're not actually the narrator in terms of speaking, but they sort of guide us through the storyline. In some ways, they're literally walking us through these scenarios.
We also inherit some of their perspective and their innate fears and their innocence, their naivete about things. And we're led through the story with those points of view. So as children, on the one hand, they're exuberant and very innocent in how they see everything. On the other hand, I always felt that there's a certain tinge of anxiety and uncertainty about things, especially with the character of Alexander, who seems to be more sensitive or susceptible to some kind of meta layer of visions or imagination or forces, if you will. And so he in particular has this sense of fear throughout the film that I think as an audience member, to me, that translates to an ominous feeling or some type of feeling of doom or something lurking in the near future that's going to be bad and it's going to happen. So as in any classic Bergman tale, it's not long before we start to see complications in the plot. And very quickly in the second part of the series, we have a death in the family, which is namely Alexander's father. But we come to it very suddenly. I mean, the whole episode kind of opens with a very rapturous performance of him as the ghost in Hamlet.
A very extended performance.
Yes, yes. But also very passionate. And the fact that he's a ghost is kind of tongue-in-cheek, I think, from Bergman's, because it's a little bit ironic since for the duration of the film, we only ever see him as a ghost. Mm-hmm. But you could see Alexander kind of in the wings of the theater watching his father's performance in absolute awe. He's almost thunderstruck. You can see him hanging on every word, every syllable. And then his father's collapse, I think, is like a bit of a rift for Alexander's character. It's a trauma, it's a shock, and he doesn't quite fully recover throughout the film with regards to the paternal figure, which down the road I think is also kind of one of the struggles that he has with the bishop who enters his life, who becomes a surrogate father or stepfather. So there's other complications psychologically speaking there as well. But I think the fact that he had this traumatic experience of watching his father fall really ill and eventually die in his bed creates that kind of complication.
One thing that's particularly unique about Fanny and Alexander is the roles that the actors play in their own lives. There's so many different characters that each seem to fit in their own little box in terms of character traits, whether it's the grandmother just doing what you would exactly expect her to do, or the specific brothers who seem to fit the role from the drunk to the womanizer. Everybody here fits into their own dramatic character trope.
For me, it's not so much tropes. I'm not exactly sure what to call it. I don't know what the term would be, but it's more like within each character or a couple, there's a performative element. And I think it's interesting to note that we have, once again, a cast of thespians. The grandmother, who's the kind of matriarch of the family in the film, if you talk about hierarchy, she's a former actress. And then you have her oldest son and his wife, he's a theater director and a performer, and she's an actress in the theater, and after his death she inherits it and becomes the theater director. And then you have the brothers and their families and the kids, and they're all amongst themselves and even to themselves acting a certain role. And in addition to the performative roles that they play, whether it's I'm the good son, or I'm the obedient daughter, or I'm the matriarch of the family, there's also meta dialogue throughout the entire miniseries of being an actor, of wearing masks, of having multiple masks, of negotiating which mask you wear with which people. And that dialogue to me was really interesting, because if you look at someone like the grandmother's character, who has lived a long life and had many roles to play, both literally on the stage, as well as a mother, a grandmother, a wife, a mistress, she talks about developing a certain skill or a knowledge about how to wear these different masks and at what time. Whereas if you look at somebody like the bishop's character, who tries to be very black and white, he admits to only having one mask, and one that is so integrally fused with the being that he's created for himself that if he rips it off, his flesh will come off with it.
Another layer of deception is the role that magic and the supernatural plays in how Bergman, for one, sort of manipulates the viewer, and also how the characters are affected by both magic and the supernatural. Especially Alexander, who encounters numerous ghosts, whether it's his father or if it's the dead children from the bishop's previous marriage that Alexander had heard about. All of them sort of play a role in Alexander as he sort of comes into almost a manhood as the story plays along. Of course, this all comes to a head later on in the film when the rabbi literally steals Fanny and Alexander in this trunk in a scene that is incredibly confusing. It didn't really make sense in the logical narrative which had existed up until that point.
This was a scene that for me was particularly awkward, and I had to do a double take around what was going on or how it was possible, because, you know, from the beginning he did enter metaphysical elements.
But they weren't established in the way that you would expect. I mean, magic was present, ghosts were present, but they weren't present to a level that you would associate with these types of plot twists.
Yeah, and that would actually alter the narrative. Like they were just sort of in the background and only visible to one character, and the story went on as the story went on. Whereas here, they fundamentally shifted the narrative of the story and what's actually possible in real life. And for me, the way that he did it, it almost felt lazy, or it certainly wasn't necessary. I think he could have created a more subtle and complex or nuanced way to have the children escape the bishop's house.
But the reason that he chose this method, I think, was that it created a foundation for the rest of the film. It established this magical element that had existed before, but it strengthened it, and suddenly magic was part of the motivations, and it led us to Alexander meeting a magician and meeting this androgynous character locked away in a room that ultimately led to the finale of the storyline. It definitely put a twist on the film, and I struggled with whether or not I agreed with this narrative decision that Bergman made. It felt wrong in a lot of ways. At least it felt wrong with the Bergman reality that I've come to understand from him over decades of his work.
The only way that I could come to terms with this element was if we go back to the original point that we made, which is that Alexander is our narrative guide. He is the eyes through which we see the story. And if you look at the structure of the film, that's the part where it kind of becomes broken in two halves. You know, you have the childhood kind of nostalgic memory era with the Christmas and all that, and then the passing of his father. And then you have the second half, which is traumatic and dark with the bishop and the austere home, and it's very, very different in this desire for escape. And I think that break could be just the way that a child would remember something like this, where part of the memories are suppressed and then something else is kind of pasted over them that you're reflecting on as an adult. And you yourself, looking back, are not exactly sure what may or may not have happened. You just knew that you wanted out and you wanted some kind of magical solution to a very dreary life that you could not for the life of you think how it could be resolved or how you could be rescued. And so you manufacture this kind of escape or abduction or a hero that you could look to that was unexpected.
Which is all fine and good, but I feel like as a filmmaker, this is quite a leap that we have to take as an audience, or at least that he's expecting us to take as an audience, which I think is where perhaps Fanny and Alexander falters a little bit.
But does it? For me, I think in particular, referencing the character of Ishmael, as you did, the kind of androgynous character who we still don't know, or at least I don't fully know, whether that's a real person. There was this really interesting fusion that Bergman tried to do, and we've seen him do this in previous film, where he wasn't as distinguishable from Alexander. I really like the part where he asked him to write on a piece of paper his name, spelling it out Alexander Ekdahl, and then when he read it back, it actually said Ishmael's name. Ishmael narrates the death of the bishop and the fat aunt who's bedridden, and their faces are closely pressed together, and he's seeing what Alexander is feeling or narrating what's inside his head. It's some kind of way, again, to express and visualize a suppressed memory or a very traumatic experience or a huge sensation of guilt. Because clearly the character of Alexander felt complicit whether the death of the bishop and the fire actually happened in real life as part of Bergman's kind of autobiographical element, or whether he felt responsible for maybe some kind of trauma in the mother's life, that he as a child became a burden or a focus and she wasn't able to have a life outside of him. There's clearly some kind of traumatic element that he's trying to spin with all of this elaborate magic and ghosts. Puppets. And God figures. I mean, if you think of the number of either paternal, authoritative, or celestial type of figures that appear throughout the film, it's quite elaborate.
The use of space in Fanny and Alexander, I think, is also very important to note. There are three major settings in the film: the grandmother's mansion, the bishop's home, and the rabbi's layer.
Puppet theater
Yeah,
workshop.
okay, that's probably a better choice. All of these spaces are labyrinths. They're very vague in terms of the space and the setting and where they lead. When you think of the bishop's home, there's corners that literally you don't know what he comes from around them, but you don't know what's on the other side. In the grandmother's mansion, I mean, it's just a vast space and every room kind of looks the same in a way, but it doesn't.
And there's secret doorways and hallways that you don't know where they come from.
Exactly. And in the rabbi's home, you don't really understand how big it is or where it leads. You just kind of know this central block and then also the room where Alexander lives. But I think that this has come up time and time again in Bergman films, this sort of labyrinth of the mind. And I think of Face to Face, for example, when the psychiatrist is sort of wandering through a bedroom and then there's corners that things pop out of and closets with secrets in them. It's something that Bergman has definitely returned to in more recent productions.
If we think of setting as allegorical to mind, I think it's also a journey through memory. And for me, I think there's different ways that you can interpret this film and enjoy it and think about it and analyze it. But at the end of it all, what it really boils down to is Bergman's origin story. He wants to tell us where he came from and how he was made. He's almost mythologizing himself. I mean, with this whole film, we get every theme that we've ever seen all in one place and sort of explained if you really think about it. We have the mistrust of authority figures. We have the personification of death, the crises of masculinity, the Bildungsroman, the authoritativeness of women and the power of the female. I mean, you look at Alexander as the main character, our narrator, our guide. He's absolutely cocooned with women, from his sisters, his cousins, his aunts, his grandmother, who's the matriarch in the family, his mother, who then becomes his matriarch and his savior. I mean, he's absolutely surrounded by women, and it's clearly altered him and shaped him to be the man or the artist that he is, and he's showing this to us from childhood.
Considering that he said this would be his final film, this is certainly an effort to sort of wrap up everything in a beautiful bow, all those thematic elements. But in pure Bergman tradition, of course, he almost goes a little too far with the final Easter scene where everyone's gathered around the table again, just like Christmas time, while Gustav delivers his speech about the beauty of life and of generations as he kisses the babies and looks forward to the future.
And praises the actors.
Of course, you can't forget that too. All of this considered, I think we can sort of conclude that yes, it is essential Bergman.
Not only that, but I think by watching this film, you get to know Bergman so much more intimately. Even though he's sort of been telling you the story all along, to have it laid out this way through himself as a child narrating his own story is a really unique perspective that can't be missed.
I ultimately felt too that it was almost as if every movie before this was a rough draft, leading up to Fanny and Alexander, which visually is sort of perfection, and the performances are beautiful. Everything just sort of felt right. It felt true. It almost felt to me like this was the movie that he had been trying to make for years in some ways. And that brings us to the end of this episode of Breaking Down Bergman. Be sure to join us next time when we are looking at the film after the rehearsal. And in the meantime, you can head over to Facebook and hit like.
Or subscribe to our channel on YouTube.
And we'll see you next time on Breaking Down Bergman.